Hello and welcome to this tutorial series where together we will build a production-ready web app with Blazor in .NET. Over the coming episodes, we will cover everything to take you from an empty project to a fully deployed application, including topics such as authentication, validation, and unit testing. In this episode, we will start with building a simple web API and connecting to a database with Entity Framework. So let's get started. So here we are in JetBrains Rider, which is the IDE I'll be using throughout this tutorial. However, you should be able to follow along just fine with something like Visual Studio. JetBrains Rider is now free for non-commercial use, so I will put a link to that into the description if you want to follow along using the same IDE. So let's go ahead and create the solution. I'm going to choose the project type as web. The solution name, I'm going to call that Blazor blog. And in the project name, I'm going to call that blazorblog.server. I'm going to choose .NET 9, and for the template, I'm going to choose Web API and leave all of the settings as default. So here we are in our brand new project, and the first thing that we're going to want to do is to create a class which will represent our blog when it's saved in the database. So I'm going to come over to the project, I'm going to add a new directory, and I'm going to call that domain. In there, I'm going to add a new class and I'm going to call that blog. So this will represent our blog when they are saved in the database. So a blog will need an ID, which I'm going to make a GUID. And I'm also going to give it some properties like a title, so we can show the user what it's called. And I'm also going to add a description so that we can tell the user a little bit about what the blog is about. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is add our Entity Framework NuGet packages. So I'm going to come back over to the project, I'm going to right click and go to Manage NuGet Packages, and I'm going to search for Microsoft.entityframework.core.SQL Server, and I'm going to add that package in. I'm also going to add in the Entity Framework core.design package. And once those have been added, we can close that. So we now need to create our data context, which will allow us to communicate with our database using Entity Framework. So if we go over to the project, right click and go to directory, I'm going to add a new directory called persistence. And in there, I'm going to add a new class, and I'm just going to call that blog data context. So this will represent our communication with the database. So we need to inherit from DB context, which comes from the Entity Framework Core NuGet package. And in the constructor, I'm going to add DB context options of type blog data context. So those are our options, and I'm going to pass that down to the base class. So I'm going to add now a property of DB set of the type blog, which is our entity we created before, and I'm going to call that blogs. So for now, that is configured. The next thing that we'll want to do is to create an Entity Framework configuration file, which tells Entity Framework how to treat this blog entity when we're communicating with the database. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is tell Entity Framework how to configure our blog entity. If we come over to our blog entity, we can see we have the GUID ID property and then these two string properties. If we don't configure it, by default, these two string properties will have an unlimited length in the database, which is not good from a performance point of view. So it's always best to configure each of your entities in Entity Framework so that we can tell Entity Framework what properties are required and also any maximum lengths that should be applied. So let's go over to our persistence folder or directory, and let's add a new directory within there, and I'm going to call this configurations. This is where we're going to put all of our configuration files for our entities in Entity Framework. So in the configurations directory, I'm going to add a new class, and I'm going to call that blog configuration. So this class will need to implement the iEntityType configuration interface from Entity Framework, and then we need to pass in which type of entity that we're configuring. In this case, it's blog. And then there'll be a missing member that we need to implement, which is this configuration method. So with this configuration method, this is where we tell Entity Framework how to set up this blog entity. So if we go back and have a look, we've got ID, title, and description. So I'm going to say builder.hasKey, and then I'm going to say that's the ID property. And I'm also going to then say builder property title, and I'm going to say that's required. So a value has to be passed in, and I'm going to say that it has a maximum length. And for now, I'm going to say maybe 256. I'm then going to do the same with the description property. It's required and has a maximum length of, let's say, 512. And then finally going to say that this particular entity belongs to a table called blogs. So we've now set up how this entity should be configured in the database. If we now go back over to our blog data context, and underneath our DB set here, I'm going to say override the on model creating method. Now in here, I'm then going to say model builder dot apply configurations from assembly, and I'm then going to say get type dot assembly. So what this method is saying is that any configurations that are found in the same assembly as this class itself will be applied to the database. So that will ensure that this entity configuration that we've just set up will be picked up and applied by Entity Framework. So that's all that. Let's close all of those. So the next thing that we're going to need to do is set up our connection string so that we can connect to the database. So let's go over to our app settings.development file. And in here, underneath the logging section, I'm going to add a section called connection strings. And in there, I'm going to add a key called blog data context. And in there, I'm going to specify our connection string. So this one is only going to be used for our local development, which is why we're in the development version of the app settings file. So in here, I'm just going to say server equals dot, which means the local machine. I'm going to say database equals blogs. I'm going to say integrated security equals true. And I'm going to say trust server certificate equals true. So that will work as a simple local development connection string for a database called blogs. So the next thing that we need to do is connect everything up in our program CS file. So if we go over to that, I'm just going to remove this weather forecast code, which comes as part of the template, and also just tidy up some of these comments. Okay, so before the builder.build, we want to say builder.services.add DB context. And then we're going to pass in our type of DB context that we created earlier, which is blog data context. Now in here, if we expand the options, we can then say options.use SQL Server. So it's telling Entity Framework to use SQL Server. And in here, we need to pass through the connection string. So we're going to get that from our settings file that we configured before. So we're going to say builder.configuration.get connection string. And in here, we need to pass through the name of the connection string to obtain, which if we look at our app settings.development file, we can see we called that blog data context. So we just pass that in there. So that's everything now connected up. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is create our first database migration. If you're using Rider, you can go to the project, right click, go to Entity Framework Core, add migration. And that allows you to specify the name of the migration, select your data context, and specify the output directory where your migrations should live. And if you click OK, that will create the migration for you. If you don't have a window like this in your IDE, you can also do it from the command window. So in my case, I can open this in the terminal. So create a new terminal in the root directory of where your blazorblog.server project resides. And if you don't have them already, you need to install the .NET EF tools, which you can do by going to .NET tool install -- global .NET-EF. So in my case, I have them already installed, but that will install it for you, and you only need to do that once on your machine. And now that they are installed, you can do .NET EF migrations add and then specify the name of your migration. So in this case, I'm going to say initial. And I'm also going to pass through a flag of output dir for output directory. And I'm going to specify in my case that I want my migrations to reside in persistence/migrations. Now, if you run that, that will create your migration for you. So that migration has been created. If we come over to the persistence directory, we can see there is now a new migrations directory. And in there, we can see we have our first initial migration, which if we have a look in here, it's creating the blog table. Perfect. The next thing would be to apply that migration to our database, which of course we don't have one yet, so that will actually create our database for us. Again, in Rider, we can right click, go to Entity Framework Core and say Update Database, and that allows us to select which migration we wish to apply and which data context. So if we click OK, that will apply the migration to our database. So once again, if you don't have a tool similar to that in your IDE, you can also update the database using the terminal window. So once again, install those tools from before if you don't have them already, and then go to .NET EF database update, and that will apply the latest migration for you as well. So let's go over and have a look at our database server to make sure that it has indeed created the database for us. You can use something like Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, or in Rider, you can actually connect to the database from here as well. I can see from my local database server that there is a database called blogs. And if we have a look in there, we can see we have two tables. One is used by Entity Framework and the other is our blogs table. And if we have a look in there, we can see we have our ID, title and description just as we configured. So that's our database setup and ready to go. So the final part to add for this first tutorial will be to add a controller so that we can add and retrieve data from the database via our API. So let's go over to our project and add a new directory called controllers. In there, I'm going to add a new class and I'm going to call it blogs controller. The blogs controller will need to inherit from controller, and I'm going to add an attribute called API controller. I'm also going to add an attribute of root, and I'm going to say that the root for this controller will be API/blogs. So before we add any actions to our controller, I just want to point out that we won't be following best practices right away. I just want to keep these actions as simple as possible to show you how everything works. And later on, we can come back, make sure that we apply security and make sure that the queries are efficient from a database point of view. So in order to add and retrieve things from the database in this controller, we will need to inject our data context. So let's add to the constructor blog data context. And then I'm going to create a method which returns a task of action result, and that will contain a list of blog. And let's call this method getAll. So to that, I'm going to add a attribute of HTTP get. And in there, to get all, I'm just going to go blog data context.blogs.toList async. We will await that, and that will return our blogs. And in there, I will just return OK with the blogs inside. So the next thing that we will want to add is the ability to get a single blog by its ID. So I'll add another method that returns a task of action result, this time of a single blog, but that will be nullable. And I'm going to call this get by ID. And of course, that will then need to take a parameter of the ID for the blog we wish to retrieve. I'm going to add a root of HTTP get that will contain the ID, and that must be a GUID. I'm then going to say blog data context dot blogs dot find async, and I'm going to pass the ID of the blog to find, and that will return our blog. Now, if that blog is null, then we will return not found, and if the blog is not null, we will return OK with the blog inside. So that's our getAll and getById methods. The next action that we will need to add is the ability to add a blog to the database. So let's say public async task of action result, and we'll call this one add. Now, in order to add a blog, we will need to pass through the blog as a parameter. And in that scenario, we would go to the blog data context, go to the blogs table and say add the blog in, and then we will say blog data context dot save changes async, and we will await that. And once that's been saved to the database, we will turn created. Once again, I'm just highlighting here at this point that we would not normally add an entity blindly into the database like this, but later on we will come back with validation and security and other best practices. So we will need to add a HTTP post attribute to that method. And finally, we're going to want to also be able to update a blog. So I'm going to say public async task action result, and that will be update. Now, in order to update a blog, we will need to pass through the updated blog, and that will have a HTTP put attribute. And in this scenario, we're going to want to first of all find the blog that they're trying to update. So we can come and copy some of this code from the get by ID. So we're going to want to find the blog that has the ID of the blog that we're passing in. If that's not found, then we need to return not found. If it is found, we then want to update the properties on the blog in the database. So for clarity, I'm going to call this existing blog. And in the existing blog, we will allow them to update the title by setting that to the title from the updated blog, and we will allow them to update the description. So we will set that to the description of the updated blog, and then finally we will save those changes to the database and return OK. So you may also want to add a delete method. So we can return a async task of action result. We'll call this one delete. And in there, we just need to take the ID of the blog that you wish to delete. And we'll add an attribute of HTTP delete. And in the root, we will take the ID. So in here, again, we will use the code from here where we obtain the existing blog by its ID. And if that's null, we will return not found. If it is found, then we will go to the blog data context, go to blogs and say remove, and pass through the blog to remove. And then we will say blog data context save changes and await that. And then finally we'll return OK. So there we have it. We have our create, read, update and delete methods for our new blog entity. As I mentioned before, there are some issues here, but we will come back to this in future episodes and refine this further. So now let's go over to Program CS to connect up our controller. So under this add open API, I'm going to say builder.services.add controllers. And before app.run, I'm going to say app.map controllers. And finally, I'm just going to change it so that it only uses HTTPS redirection when not running in development. And that just avoids us having any issues around HTTPS when running in development mode. So let's test it out. So I'm going to come up to the run configurations and I'm going to run the HTTP version, not the HTTPS version. And I'm going to run that. And we can see it's now running on this address here. Your port number will probably be different. I'm going to right click that and copy, and I'm going to go over to Postman. So Postman is some free software that you can use to test API endpoints. You can do this inside Rider and I believe also inside Visual Studio. There are other pieces of software as well, like Insomnia, but I just prefer to use Postman for this. The point is that they will allow us to send a test API request to the controller that we've just written, and that will allow us to test that our code is working. In future episodes, we will actually have a front end that will make the request for the user and display the results in the web page. So we'll only need this for this initial test. For now, let's just make a GET request to the address of our server /API/blogs, which is the route we gave to the controller. Let's send that. and we can see here that we've got a 200 response with an empty collection, which is great. That means that the server is up and running, and of course there's nothing in the database at the moment, so this is the exact response that we would expect. So let's try and add a blog to the database. So if we go back over to our controller, we can see we need to use the HTTP post action, and we need to provide in the body of the request a blog. If we go back over to blog, we know there's an ID, a title, and a description. So back over in Postman, I'm going to create a new request. I'm going to change the type to post. I'm going to put in the URL of the controller, and I'm going to go to body, select raw, and change the type to JSON. I'm then going to create a JSON object here that represents the blog. So we know there's an ID property, there's a title property, and there's a description property. So I'm going to put in the title, my first blog. This is the first blog. Now we wouldn't normally allow the user to specify their own ID, so let's remove this. This is one of the things that I said earlier we will need to change in the future. So let's go back over to our controller. And in the add method, I'm just going to add an extra piece of code that says when the blog comes into this method, we're going to set the ID to a new GUID. And I'm going to restart the server. Back over in Postman, let's give it a go. Okay, we can see we've got a 201 created response, which is exactly what we programmed in to happen. So now if we go back over to our getAll method and run that again, you can see we've got a 200, and there is our first blog in the database. Let's go over and have a look at the database, and in our blogs table, there is our first blog. So let's take the ID of this blog and try the update method. So back in Postman, I'm going to duplicate the add tab, and I'm going to change this to put, which will make it an update instead. And in the body, we will now need to provide the ID property and set that to the ID of the blog that's currently in the database. And I'm just going to put some extra characters on the end here, and I'm going to post that in. And you can see we got a 200 OK. If we go back over to our getAll method, we can see that that update has been applied. So I'm now going to duplicate the get. I'm going to put in slash and pass in the ID, which will correspond with the get by ID action we created earlier. And try that. And there we go, we've got 200 and we've got the blog. So that's the get by ID method tested. And finally, the other method to test would be the delete. So if we duplicate this again and change this to delete and send, we got a 200 OK. And if we go back to the getAll, we can see that that is now empty. And that's now all of the actions tested on our API controller. We can now get, add, update, and delete blogs from our database using our API. This puts us in a really good position, ready to create our Blazor frontend in the next episode. If you found this useful, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really does help me out, and you'll get notifications when I post future tutorials on this and many other topics that I plan to do in the future. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.